finally, Miscavige gets himself into a position where certainly by let's say by 1984, with all this internal, check and checkmate and moves and getting rid of people and stuff, Miscavige is now in a position where he's basically the single guy running or making the major decisions on a day-to-day basis for Scientology internationally, because Hubbard's off in his thing, and he's reporting to Hubbard. And there are people who are still not friendly to Miscavige. I mean, it's not totally like this clean coup yet. Hasn't quite totally happened yet, but it has gotten to a place where most people are thinking that Hubbard wants it this way, and reports are going up and down the lines. And there are people who are having some problems with what Miscavige is doing still, but they got to be careful about how they're going about doing what they're doing. Okay, so 1984 comes around, and Miscavige gets the idea that they need money because they're fighting all these court cases. Remember, I said I think it was 46 court cases. There's still this Christofferson verdict. They're fighting that publicly. They've got this whole crusade that they're doing in Portland, or they do this in a little bit, in a couple of years. They need money. The church's income had been book sales and service sales of Scientology services, but Scientology's never had millions of members. It's never been this huge multi-million member operation. It's really not ever gone above a few 100,000 members at any one time. And this time period is the time when it was at its peak. So they're not making enough money to deal with all the problems that they've got. And the church is going to go under. And this is a constant threat. This is a constant albatross around Miscavige's neck, because he wanted the power and he wanted the guy to be, he wanted to be responsible. So these are the problems he's going to have to deal with. So they form up what's called the International Association of Scientologists as a membership trust. And they get people to start donating to it. And they're not getting anything back for their money. Up until this time, Hubbard's policies had always stated very, very unequivocally that you are to sell Dianetics and Scientology services and books and lectures, and that's how we make our money. We do not just take money from people for nothing. He was very, very clear about that. And an earlier effort to do something like that, to get that going for the legal fund, Hubbard quashed that. He said, no, that's not what you do. You sell Dianetics and Scientology, you make this thing make money, and that's how you make money to fight the legal stuff. Well, it wasn't working. And the organizations were floundering and things were not going well and they were not making enough money. So they started this thing called the IAS. And I don't know that Hubbard ever knew about it. And they started it in 1984, and they started getting people to just give them money for their war chest, is what they called it. They started sending out sales guys to fundraisers to drum up money for the IAS, so they could fight the legal battles. And they would brief that, the public at large, the Scientologists at large, that they had legal issues and they needed, the psychiatrists were attacking, the government was attacking, everybody was after Scientology because it was so good and so workable, and it was changing the face of mankind, and it was saving planet Earth. So clearly all the bad elements on the planet that would not want the Earth to be better and would not want people to rise up out of their slave-like conditions, all those guys were now, fighting Scientology. They were trying to take Scientology out. And it was only the Sea Organization and the International Association of Scientologists that were going to prevent that destruction of Scientology. And so give your money now. And that's been the basic sales pitch of the IAS ever since it started in 1984. And it is an amazingly effective sales pitch. You might look at it from an outside point of view and go, well, that's crazy. But when you're in it and you're being sold that, that the church is on the ropes and we need your money because we're not going to survive without it, and you're a dedicated Scientologist, you can't give over the money fast enough. And it worked. They accumulated a boatload of money. And it wasn't earmarked for anything. They could do whatever they wanted to with this money. And they did have legal issues and legal problems, and this is and the IRS was coming after them. So They needed the money. It wasn't just to give, David Miscavige a nice set of shoes and a nice dinner, He did that with some of the money too, but that's how that went down. And the IAS is kind of a big deal because it was such a bold move that was completely contrary to what L. Ron Hubbard had specifically said he did not want done. And they just said no.
Why? Do you know why?
It was just Hubbard's philosophy. He was into exchange. Hubbard was there. I've mentioned this in some of my videos because it seems to rub some people the wrong way because they want to look at Hubbard as this con man, and he was a con man, but he wasn't a wholly unprincipled one. And if that sounds odd, well, it's just kind of how people are. And and Hubbard specifically had this thing about exchange. This was one of the reasons why he hated taxes, is because he didn't feel like the government was exchanging anything back to him. He's like, I'm giving you this money and I'm not getting anything back. And he really had this thing about exchange, and he talked about it in his policies and in his lectures. So he wanted Scientology to be built on a backbone of fair exchange. In fact, better than fair exchange. And he believed in his product. I mean, he might have started with con man ways and he was repackaging hypnosis as we went over. But over the years, and certainly I'm absolutely convinced that by the mid-1960s, he was absolutely a true believer in his own product and his own con. And he was all in on it. So he thought that he really did have an insight and a knowledge that other human beings didn't have, and he really wanted to get it to them. In spite of all the greed and megalomania and narcissism and everything else, this can still be true. All of that can be true. All those bad things can be true, and yet Hubbard still had some principles, and this exchange thing was one of them, and this is how he wanted his organizations run. And it was just not practical because Scientology wasn't a good enough product. It was a mess. And Hubbard's other inclinations of vindictiveness and narcissism and megalomania were running the organization into the ground as fast as people could build it up, you see. So it was this constant push-pull between his insanity and his desire to help that makes Scientology such an interesting and conflicted story. Right. So Miscavige said, well, if we're going to keep surviving, we ain't doing that. So they start the IAS. And he had everybody on board with it. Like I said, I don't know that he ever told Hubbard about it. Hubbard was, at this point, living in Creston, California. They had settled at a ranch out there outside San Luis Obispo. And the church still owns this property. You can look it up online and see photos of it and stuff. And you're not allowed to go anywhere near the property. To this day, you go up there and try to get on the property, they will stop you. And this is where Hubbard lived out his final years. And again, Pat and Annie Broker were his caretakers, and he wasn't wholly invalid. There were stories of him going into town and stuff and whatnot. But this is where he was. So he's off the lines, out of the picture. There's communications going back and forth in writing, but there's no phone calls. And of course, this is in the 80s when there's no internet or anything like that. So conceivably, Miscavige could have started this entire fundraising effort, and Hubbard never would have known anything about it if nobody told him. And if Miscavige and Broker agreed that, no, we're not going to tell the old man about this, we need to do it because it's the church's survival at stake, then that was how it went down, and very easily could have gone down that way. So the IAS starts up. They start making more money, and with that money, they start dealing with these legal issues, and they also start a counter campaign against a PR campaign, I should say, against the IRS, because they need the IRS to buckle and give them their tax exemption back. And remember, they had it taken away from them in 1967, Absolutely. And they had not been paying their taxes. And that's a problem. So that was another massive debt that was accumulating, right? I mean, say what you will about Miscavige, he did deal with all of this, as we'll show here. This is the only time, this is the only stuff that he ever actually dealt with successfully. So by 86, Hubbard dies. Miscavige is basically running everything by now. But there is still this tension between ASI and RTC, because RTC is still the structural organization that holds the copyrights and the trademarks. And Miscavige is not in charge of that yet. He's in charge of ASI, which is Author Services, which is Hubbard's personal literary agent. When Hubbard dies, I think the calculation that Miscavige made was he looked at this and went, okay, I can keep running this organization that's collecting the royalties on Hubbard's legacy of writing, or I take over the organization that holds the trademarks and service marks of Dianetics and Scientology, and I actually take over the church as an entity. And for however he made that calculation, he did, because in 1986, after Hubbard dies, I think it was either late 86 or early 87, Miscavige and a couple of his most loyal followers march into the offices of RTC at the international base, and this is in outside San Jacinto, California, and takes over. He kicks out the woman who was in charge of RTC. Her name was Vicky Asnaran. And he kicks out some other people, and there was some physical confrontation that occurred here. I've interviewed a man named Jesse Prince who was there in the room at the time, and he actually was so distraught and pissed off at this coup that was happening right in front of him that he went and got a gun and threatened Miscavige with it. And anyway, Miscavige talked him down and succeeded. That was the only resistance. That was the only real effort on somebody's part to physically resist Miscavige taking over, but Jesse didn't follow through on that, and probably a good thing that he didn't kill anybody. But Miscavige succeeded. That was the point when he took over RTC, and he went from being the chairman of the board of ASI to becoming the chairman of the board of RTC. And from that position, he now had full control over the trademarks and service marks of Dianetics and Scientology, which basically put him in charge of licensing which organizations could and couldn't be Scientology organizations, and therefore gave him ultimate power and authority over all of Dianetics and Scientology.
But he kept power. He kept control over ASI, right?
He did not. He actually went to RTC and became chairman of the board there, and he installed somebody as the head of ASI that he controlled.
Because he couldn't do both?
No, he did. He chose not to. For whatever reason, he took over RTC, and he did no, and he no longer controlled ASI. But for all intents and purposes, and this is the important part, what title he gave himself isn't the important part here. The important part is that everybody of any consequence who held any degree of responsibility or power at the upper levels of Scientology recognized that he was the one who was in charge. And if they crossed him, he would take them out. And here's how he could do that. And this is something that often gets missed, especially in courts of law, because it's this invisible factor. And that is the factor of the Sea Organization. The Sea Organization, all of these people, ASI, RTC, all of international management of Scientology, the one thing all these people have in common is that they are Sea Org members first. They've all signed a billion-year contract of commitment to achieve the aims and goals of Scientology.
And you're not exaggerating when you say a billion years.
What's that?
You're not exaggerating when you say a billion years.
The contract literally says I commit myself for a billion years.
Which infers some sort of reincarnation sort of thing?
Yeah, Scientologists believe in life after life after life.
Right.
You are an immortal spiritual being called a Thetan. You have lived a near infinite amount of time in the past, and you will live infinitely into the future. You cannot die. This is a core belief of Scientology.
Right.
So past lives are just a matter of course. I mean, of course you have past lives. What do you think? You started here now? No, you've been living forever. So you've had past lives and you're going to have future lives. So you commit to the next billion years in the Sea Org because you're all in on this thing, right? I mean, imagine the mindset. I've been there. I signed that contract. You know, I held out for 17 years. That's how long I lasted as a Sea Org member. It's a little short of a billion. But this is the commitment the Sea Org members make. And more importantly, the Sea Organization is sort of this fraternal organization. It doesn't exist. It's not a corporation. It's not a membership trust. There's no legal documents anywhere that incorporate the Sea Organization. It's simply an agreement that these Scientologists have amongst themselves. A commitment, really. I mean, agreement is too light a word. It's a discipline. It is a real group. It really exists, but it doesn't have corporate existence. You can't go sue the Sea Org. You can't take the Sea Org to court. You know what I mean? Right. So all of these people are Sea Org members first. And David Miscavige is the head of the Sea Org. He's the guy at the top of the ranks of the Sea Org. So if he doesn't like what you're doing, or you buck that system in some fashion, then he will use Sea Org discipline on you to remove you and get you out of the way. The corporate stuff is smoke and mirrors to them. They don't think about their organizations within the world of Scientology. They don't think about corporate structures and boards of directors and things like this. These are not important terms to Scientologists, and especially not to Sea Org members. If you're in the Sea Org, you're all in at whatever job it is you're assigned to do. You're expected to be a hardcore janitor, or you're expected to be a hardcore, manager, or a course room supervisor, or the head of Scientology. All of these things are jobs that you could end up having as a Sea Org member. So all the corporate shenanigans, nobody really keeps track of that stuff inside Scientology. The lawyers do, the accountants do, and the guys at the very top do. David Miscavige keeps his finger on all this stuff. But the rest of the Sea Org doesn't. They just listen to David Miscavige because he's the head of the Sea Org. And the Scientologists have learned over the years, as Miscavige has come out publicly, that he's the one who heads up this whole structure. He's the guy at the top. He's the chairman of the board. You know, nobody could tell you who else sits on the board. Nobody knows. Nobody cares. You know, within the world of Scientology, that's just not important. So this is why, if he was over ASI or RTC, not really that super important in terms of the internal machinations. But from a corporate point of view, I was trying to make the case that it made more sense for him to take over RTC if he wanted to put himself in a position where he held real power over Scientology, because he's the guy who is the determining factor as to who gets the trademarks and service marks and who doesn't. And back in the 80s, that meant more than it does now, too, because they were really big on enforcing their trademark standards. And there were people who had left the Church of Scientology, high-level people who had worked right under Hubbard, who tried to form their own churches of Scientology, their own independent activities. And they got squashed. I mean, they just got legally and illegally squashed hard by David Miscavige and by RTC, using those trademark laws, right? They took them to court, and that's how they got rid of those guys. So there was power to be had in having control of those trademarks and stuff.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's power, yeah.
Yeah. And this is now, okay, so Hubbard dies. They hold an event and they announce this fact to everybody. And David Miscavige is the MC of this event. And this was the first time that most people had ever seen or heard of David Miscavige outside of the Sea Org. So now he's this little guy on stage in a white uniform, and everybody's kind of like, who's this guy? You know? And he looks important, and he talks like he's important, and he's emceeing this event, and they're talking about L. Ron Hubbard's legacy and how it's going to go forward into the future. This was also the only public appearance that I'm aware of Pat Broker, the guy who had been with Hubbard up until the end. He was also on the stage, and he made promises about how L. Ron Hubbard had done further research into these OT levels, and there was all this stuff, and they were going to release it, and it was going to be amazing. So there was this sort of, the whole point of that announcement of L. Ron Hubbard's dying event was not to just announce Hubbard's death, but to also make it clear that the church was going to continue, and this was the leadership that the church was going to be under. So Miscavige didn't have to announce that he was the guy in charge of everything. He just sort of assumed that people got that. And then he continued running things from behind the scenes. You know, at the upper levels, you don't have to make daily public appearances for people to know you're in charge. They just see your name on things from time to time, and they know.
Got it. So it just becomes kind of a transition into that.
Exactly.
Not necessarily requiring some big formal announcement, it sounds like.
Exactly.
Okay.
So he was just kind of there, right? There's still a lot of people at the upper levels of Scientology. Management actually was existing. It was running. There was a structure in place. Miscavige was the head of this thing, but he was dealing with the IRS problem now. And now that Hubbard had died, all those court cases were not really as important anymore. I mean, they were important, but now that L. Ron Hubbard, was not, he was named as a defendant, but nobody was going to depose L. Ron Hubbard now. So that kind of took a lot of stress off that whole All Clear project and all of that stuff, right? So now Miscavige's focus was entirely on church survival. And the main threat to that survival was the IRS. So he was working with the lawyers. He was working with legal. They also had these other independent Scientology groups popping up that had to be squashed. And they had the day-to-day operations of the church. And so there was a management level structure that was kind of running the church's day-to-day, week-to-week operations. And Miscavige was no longer totally, so involved in all of that. The IRS problem became front and center, and Miscavige was orchestrating legal maneuvers, private investigations of IRS employees. There were something like 1,400 lawsuits brought against the IRS by individual Scientologists. There was a PR campaign being run. There was a thing the church was publishing called Freedom Magazine, which was doing monthly exposés on IRS abuses. And the IRS was an abusive organization. They would get involved in some pretty crazy, nonsensical stuff. And they would break the laws in enforcing tax codes, and they were kicking families out of their homes and, all the crap that the IRS gets up to. Well, the church was highlighting all that stuff, right? They were making a big deal about it, and they were trying to get Senate hearings. They were really going to town, taking down the IRS, to the point that Miscavige even narrated and starred in a video proposing an alternative tax system. And they proposed a VAT tax in America. And they said, do away with the IRS entirely. We don't need them. Let's just replace it with a sales tax.
I remember when that was in politics, the value-added tax.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
Yeah. So
they were kind of hopping on that bandwagon, all in the direction of trying to get the IRS to capitulate and give them back tax-exempt status and clear the books. That was the goal. There wasn't any other target in sight but that. And it was literally live or die for the Church of Scientology. The structure was in place. They had started in 1986, 87, 88. They had started an extremely successful Dianetics promotional campaign. Remember those with the questions? And then Dianetics, right? They'd say what's the thing that's ruining your life? Page 13, right? And what's the single source of problems for mankind? Page 56. And then Dianetics would appear on the commercial, right? And then it'd be like, ooh, Dianetics. This is the book that has the answers to all those questions they're posing about your personal problems and the problems you're having in life. This was a very successful campaign. Dianetics became a bestseller again for like 100 straight weeks or something in the 1980s.
Right.
Like 37 years after it was published. So that happened. And that was all happening under Miscavige's watch, but it wasn't being ordered by him. It was being done by dedicated Sea Org members who, had a vision of actually trying to promote Dianetics and Scientology and get it going again. So that worked. Ironically, the guy who came up with that whole campaign has got kicked out of the church by Miscavige years later for being a horrible, awful person. I know him. He's a friend of mine. So Scientology is kind of basically, after Hubbard dies, it's starting to become a more well thought of, publicized, promoted thing in the general public. It is the late 80s now. People are not looking at it as this horrible, awful cult. They've reformed. They got rid of the GO. Hubbard died. We got rid of all the bad apples, right? This is the public face that the church is putting on, and it's working.
Okay, and this reminds me of this period reminds me of kind of the post-polygamy Mormonism where the church realized that it became a state in the United States. Eventually it was voted in. And then eventually it realized that having these long-bearded polygamous prophets wasn't going to jive well with the modernization of America. And so starting in the 50s, the church cleaned up its act, got rid of polygamy, figured out its corporate structures, began to modernize, and began to fight for, an image that became squeaky clean, clean cut, almost like IBM level, business-like and American. And you go from Mormons being these creepy, weird, bearded polygamists on the frontier to like Donny Osmond,
right,
level, like, the Mormons are the good guys, the squeaky clean, hardworking, honest, family-based people. And that was a long haul of the church cleaning up its act, getting its finances in order, almost going bankrupt, but then reworking its image. And in a very short period of time, let's just say a few decades, going from being a laughingstock scourge that's bankrupt to a growing global, almost well-respected organization that started to have a great deal of influence, and most importantly, celebrities like the Osmonds, the Marriotts, Steve Young, and athletes and that sort of thing.
That is exactly parallel. That is precisely what Miscavige was trying to do with Scientology.
Yeah,
and he couldn't quite get there at this time period because of the IRS threat. So that was where all of his attention, or most of his attention, was at. But internally within the church, exactly what you just said. Everything you just said is exactly what Scientology was trying to get going. Come out of their dark phase and their awful phase and people in jail phase to, no, we're good people. Look, we have this moral code, and we have Dianetics, and it will help you with your mind. And we have Scientology, and it will bring you to advanced spiritual states of existence that you can't even believe and dream about. And that's what we have to offer. And aren't we a wonderful bunch of people? And isn't this all just great? That's exactly the image the church was trying to put out there. And they repackaged the entire grade chart, all the materials of Dianetics and Scientology got new book covers and new, glossy look. They had previously, Hubbard's lectures had been on reel-to-reel lectures, right? That was the quality. That was where their technology was at. So they started converting all of that to cassette tapes, because that was, the latest and greatest they could afford in the 80s. And they started doing they've started building in-house publishing facilities, and they were really trying to make a go of this thing, and put on the best public face that they could. And like I said, it was starting to work. And certainly people were willing to line up behind the message that the IRS are the bad guys, not the Church of Scientology. Anybody in the 80s could connect with that message. And of course, it helped that the IRS was an abusive organization itself. So Miscavige is fighting this fight, and The Dianetics is now beginning. I think statistically speaking, if I remember right, Dianetics as a word went from like 10% name recognition across the United States to like 90% within a year or two because of this promotional campaign and stuff. And this is what the Sea Org was working on. So then somewhere around 91, I think it was, this IRS problem was just kind of persisting and persisting and persisting. And internally, Miscavige was still more than happy to get rid of anybody who crossed him or got in his path. But being as focused as he was on this, he went and actually dropped in at the IRS office and went and talked to the commissioner of the IRS. Goldberg, I think his name was. And they actually started hammering out an agreement. And by 93, the IRS basically was exhausted. They only have, people think of the government of the United States as this monolithic organization where all the money goes into this black box and look at all this billions that they have and they can solve any problem and do anything they want. But it doesn't really work that way. And the IRS specifically is like any other department or division of the government has a budget. They get allocated a certain amount of money and that's what they get. And if all of that money gets tied up in legal threats and suits and fighting private investigators who are literally following your employees around, and they're not down with this, they're quitting, they don't want to be stalked by Scientology because they're trying to work for the IRS. So there were lots of reasons why the IRS commissioner was like, look, I'm kind of done with this. Can we just drop it and move on? And, you got to give me something here. And so Scientology spent 2 years and there was a lot of back and forth and there were a lot of questions. I've got all these documents. And they hammered out an agreement. And of course, and I have documented it in my book and in videos, the Church of Scientology lied through their teeth to the IRS about what their activities are, about what their structure is, about what their goals are. They gave them a song and dance. They told the IRS exactly what the IRS wanted to hear. And the IRS capitulated. And in 1993, they gave them tax-exempt status back. All the churches of Scientology, all the organizations, all the sub-organizations, everything they wanted, they got. In exchange for that, they paid a pretty hefty sum of back taxes, but it wasn't the amount that would have destroyed the church. I mean, I think at this point they had accumulated something on the order of $1 billion tax debt or something. I mean, it was big. And they forgave that. I think they ended up paying him a couple million or something. And that was it. The war was over. And I cannot even begin to overstate the importance of this victory for Miscavige, for his position as the leader of Scientology, and for Scientologists in general. Because now they could claim deductions on their tax returns for Scientology donations and services. And people in Scientology sometimes pay tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars at a pop to the church. So to now have it be, to get tax credit on that, to have it be tax exempt, right? And it gave the church a whole new lever to use to get people to donate because their donations are tax deductible, So this was a huge, huge coup, big, gigantic one. And David Miscavige, within a week of getting the tax exemption, organized this gigantic event at the LA Sports Arena, 10,000 person capacity, and they packed that place. It was the one time they actually packed an event hall. And they had people flying in from around the world for this special announcement. Nobody knew what it was. I went there. I was in Santa Barbara at the time. I was on staff, and I drove down to LA to go to this event. So I was there, and I heard him, and it was this 3-hour briefing. He talked all about the history of the church's battle with the IRS and how the IRS were, a bunch of, horrible, awful people who had tried to take out Scientology over the years, along with Interpol and the FBI and the CIA and every other alphabet organization that ever existed. They were all against Scientology. They all wanted its doom and destruction, and they had beaten them all. And David Miscavige is the one who did this entire briefing. And if you didn't know who David Miscavige was at this point as a Scientologist, you were definitely going to know now. And of course, I actually skipped over the fact that in 92, he had done a interview on Nightline with Ted Koppel. And that also got him out into the public eye.
I remember that.
Time.
Yeah, that was pretty bold, right?
Yes, it was. And he came out as the leader of Scientology, and he, duked it out with Ted Koppel. I just watched it a few days ago. I just rewatched that to answer a question somebody had, and he, he didn't really come off that badly. I mean, he came off horribly if you actually want to look at a factual, account of what he said. He was just, throwing the lies out left, right, and center about what Scientology is really all about. But he kind of, held his own against Koppel's questions, enough so, as good as any politician would do, let's put it that way. And so he got a lot of cred for that, because this was the first time that Scientologists were ever seeing anybody from Scientology duking it out with Ted Koppel on Nightline and presenting Scientology as this wonderful, amazing, you guys are just a bunch of liars. You don't get it. This is what we're all about. This is a good thing, da-da-da. And Scientologists loved that, right? So that gave him a lot of cred. But then this IRS victory happens. I just can't overstate it. David Miscavige was God after this. I mean, he was just the man. He was the head of Scientology. Everybody knew he was the head of Scientology now. He was the spokesperson. He was the representative. He was the guy who was leading the whole movement. And look what he just accomplished. And of course, this was all worded in such a way that he was the one who, made it all happen. But in a way, he did. This was his big victory moment. And this was sort of the pinnacle of his achievement for Scientology, as he did save the church, and everybody knew it. So he was untouchable at this point, and that's really the key takeaway I'm trying to get across at this point. Is by 1993, no one was ever going to challenge David Miscavige, and internally, anybody who even looked at him the wrong way was going to get shipped off to the RPF. The RPF, or the Rehabilitation Project Force, is the Sea Organization's prison system and re-education system. And it is like a re-education camp. There is harsh physical discipline and physical labor. And then there is 5 hours a day of re-education, you could say, where you apply, you use Dianetics and Scientology techniques and methods on one another, and kind of get your head re-indoctrinated back into being a good, loyal Sea Org member. I did that program. We can talk more about it when we talk about my thing. But if you cross Miscavige, that's the best thing that'll happen to you, is being sent to the RPF.
So, So can you talk about the strategy real quick of getting celebrities into Scientology? Was that...
Oh, sure.
Did that start with Hubbard, or did that start with Miscavige? And talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a separate thing.
Is that something you were going to get to later, or?
No. It's fine. It's fine. Okay. We can talk about it now. Then we'll get back to the timeline, because there's a little bit more about Miscavige I would like to talk about that's happened since '93. But this is a great question, and it's perfectly valid, because it's a key way that Scientology has kept going. In the 1950s, L. Ron Hubbard recognized the power of celebrity. And he actually wrote an issue suggesting that various celebrities be specifically targeted to be made into Dianetic, Scientologists. That was the first inkling of it. But over the years, I think in 1968 or 69 or so, a woman named Yvonne Jench, or Yvonne Gillum, was a Sea Org member. She was an Australian Sea Org member who had come up and been part of, joined Hubbard's Sea Organization early on. And she was this really bright light bulb of a personality. She could light up a room. Everybody loved her. I mean, literally, everybody loved her. To this day, people sing her praises. Yvonne is just this magical person that somehow got involved in Scientology, and despite all of its awfulness, she continued to remain this very bright bulb and very inspiring character in the Scientology history. She had the idea of taking this thing about celebrities and running with it. And she actually got herself out to Hollywood and started an organization called Celebrity Center. And she took Hubbard's ideas and policies and ideas about, how to run Scientology, and she applied it to this artistic community. And in 1969, there was a public for that. I mean, huge public for that. And she built on the whole movement of, the counterculture movement, artist movement, all this kind of stuff. She brought all that in, and she started it from scratch, really. She went out there on this mission to start Celebrity Center, and she just kind of ran with it. And she started bringing in low-level celebrities, actors, singers, poets. They did poetry night readings and song nights and things like that. And it appealed to people. They came in and they started doing Scientology services. And it was scrape. It was bare, it was just like barely surviving to start with, but it started building up. And then she started getting more, higher level. Like I think she got some guy who'd been on a couple TV shows in, and some singers in, and some other people of note. And slowly this thing built up. And Celebrity Center is now a network of organizations throughout the Scientology world, operating out of this building that they bought, this old Chateau Hotel in Hollywood, which they renovated in the 90s at great expense. And they cater specifically and only to celebrities or their entourages.
So tell us again her name.
What's that?
Her name again?
Yvonne Gillum.
Yvonne Gillum. She starts what year?
68, 69, I think is when Celebrity Center started.
Yeah. Wow, that's so profound. 70s.
Yeah, she was, like I said, every single person I have ever met, and I've talked to quite a few, who ever had anything to do with her, just has nothing but good things to say about her. She was just the nicest, kindest, most helpful person. She really cared about people. And it was on the strength of that she built up Celebrity Center, and she was able to get the trust and loyalty of celebrities. And she gathered them around her, and she wasn't in it for her. She really believed in the whole mission of Scientology, to the point that she did some pretty awful stuff. I mean, she ended up basically abandoning her kids for this whole thing. So she was a pretty shitty mother, but she was, this great Scientologist. And she ended up dying, I think, of cancer in the 80s, and they kind of erased her names from the books because, you're either Hubbard or you're Miscavige, and if you're anybody else, you can't have a name. And that's kind of the history of Scientology as far as that goes. But at the time that she was around and building this whole thing up and running it, she was a goddess. She was really a queen. And she built this thing up. They got John Travolta involved in the mid-70s. He got into Scientology and he got Welcome Back Kotter around then, and then Grease, of course, and, everything after that. And he attributed his success to Scientology, and this became a big thing. And they really started getting the return on investment that you can get from celebrities. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. But it's big. It's a big deal. And John Travolta was personally responsible for bringing a lot of people into Scientology in the 70s and 80s because he was promoting it. As long as his career was going great and he was talking about it and stuff, Scientology was completely happy with him. And they got more and more celebrity people involved, right? They have a little group of these guys. Tom Cruise got involved in the 80s through his then wife, Mimi Rogers, who was a second-generation Scientologist. And it helped him with his dyslexia. He was sold on it. And Tom Cruise, being the rather intense personality that he is, he went all in. And he got really heavily involved in Scientology in the 80s. Talked about it a little bit, married Nicole Kidman, and then kind of wavered for a number of years. But then they got him back in the late 90s and got Nicole out of the picture and just focused on Cruise. and they got him back in the fold in a huge way. And he started drumming up business for them again in the early 2000s. And you remember the Matt Lauer interview and jumping on Oprah's couch and meeting Katie and all that nonsense. Well, that was all Scientology inspired. And Tom Cruise was amazing because he could literally mention a Scientology book. You know, he goes on Good Morning America and he says, you know, you want to know about Scientology, just read a book, like Fundamentals of Thought. Go read that book. And he holds it up or something, right? And it looks like this casual thing. And that morning, like 8,000, 10,000 copies of the book get sold. You know, it's like a big deal. Like when celebrities talk, people listen.
Yeah, for sure.
The church loved it, you know. So that's how they use celebrities. That's
really profound. And we could do probably an entire series on John Travolta and Tom Cruise and others. But
oh yeah, there's tons to know. There are lots and lots of details. I'm really just doing broad strokes here.
Sure. Okay.
But I argue that it's an arguable claim that had John Travolta and Tom Cruise never gotten involved in Scientology, it would not exist today. There's definitely a valid argument to be made with that.
Yeah, and you know, I mentioned the Osmonds just as an example. They weren't recruited, but they came out of Mormonism. But you go to Europe or Latin America, and you realize that there was this whole generation of people who joined the church in the 60s and 70s when David O. McKay, one of our prophets, really started expanding the mission efforts, temple building, you know, the stellar popularity of Donnie and Marie, and that can't be understated. They were almost on the level of Michael Jackson, the Jackson 5 back in the day. You know, they had their own variety show on TV. They were just huge. You know, you just cannot understate the impact of a religion glomming on to celebrities.
Big time. It's huge. It's a really, really amazingly good marketing idea.
And now, but until it backfires, because now, as I told you, we just interviewed Wayne Sermon from Imagine Dragons. We've had Benji Schwimmer on, who won season 2 of So You Think You Can Dance. We've had Tyler Glenn on from Neon Trees. Nowadays, because the Mormon church has attacked gay and lesbian people, it's having a harder time hanging on to its celebrities, because that's become this huge fissure in the church that's leading the celebrities to bail and to be embarrassed. Because how do you survive in show business if you're part of a church that's perceived as homophobic? It's kind of hard, right?
Exactly. Which is why we try so hard to get the truth out about Scientology's homophobia, because it's rampant throughout the church. And these celebrities lie about it. And I don't know if they're lying purposefully or because this is what they're told to do and they believe it. But I can't believe, if you've read Hubbard's materials, that you don't understand why the church is extremely homophobic.
And that's the problem of religion, is that oftentimes, you know, the founders lived 50 or 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 2 millennia ago. And so whatever social mores were acceptable at the time, like homophobia, get baked into the founding documents of the religion. And how do you stay true to the founder, but then erase the things that are well known that they taught and said about certain things like sexuality? And it puts in a church in a real bind, because they have to honor the founders. And you can see all the, you know, Tom Cruise, LRH or whatever it is, you know, it's just salute. Just like Joseph Smith, you know, the Mormon church worships Joseph Smith. In some sense, I'm guessing Scientology worships LRH or L. Ron Hubbard. But that means you have to stay true to their teachings. But if their teachings were problematic, how do you do both? And that's how these churches are coming up. But one of the reasons churches are having significant problems in the modern day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're absolutely right. Scientology is no different. Its dogma and morals come out of the 1950s, and they're stuck with that, you know, and that's what they do. And they pretend otherwise. And at the lower levels, you know, it's not entirely a pretense. You can come in and do Scientology as a member of the LGBT community, but you're only going to get so far before you're going to start finding that they're going to be talking to you about it, and they're going to be concerned about it, and they're going to be showing you things that Hubbard wrote, and they're going to be saying, you know, we think there might be a problem here, and we might want you to look at this, you know, and then it's going to go deeper and deeper, and there's going to come a certain point where you're not going to be able to advance anymore in Scientology until you deal with your aberration, as they call it, your, you know, problem.
Yeah.
There's no way you're ever going to be allowed anywhere near those upper OT levels if you're a practicing homosexual. There's just simply no way around that.
Right.
Not that you really want those OT levels anyway, but it's just sort of a, it's just a hypocrisy that needs to be pointed out.
Yeah.
So that's a whole thing, and it's a big deal, and we've really tried to bring that up to people and show that. And the celebrities, one of the problems with celebrities, of course, versus regular people is that when they go on and talk to millions of people at a shot on talk shows and things, people don't realize how much they get to dictate the course of the conversation. And so they don't get asked uncomfortable questions. They don't get asked hard questions because the talk shows are built on an industry where they need the repeat business. They need the celebrities to keep coming around and be on their shows, so they can't offend them. You offend a celebrity on one of those talk shows, you're never going to see that celebrity again. And that's bad business for the talk shows. So they don't ask them hard questions, or they ask them questions in a very crafted, cultivated way that the celebrity has a pre-scripted answer for, and that's it. And aren't they so brave for saying that? And they don't really get called out or confronted on this stuff, and that's a shame. But that's the world we live in.
And we can talk about that more later, but we're facing that as well. The media, when a church becomes super powerful, it has a crap ton of money, massive law firms at its disposal, and then not only celebrities, but also business executives with a lot of money and power. They can wield influence, and the religious protections that go around the First Amendment, and just this general, broader, sort of vehement passion within American consciousness that religions can't be attacked, that religions need to be respected. All of that money and power and influence and celebrity and protection can become just an incredible protector of religious traditions that may be doing really horrible things, but the media won't want to touch it because of all the power and money and influence that affects the livelihood of a newspaper or affects the reputation of a news source.
That's exactly right.
And we see that all the time here in Salt Lake City, and I don't mean to sidetrack, but like the Salt Lake Tribune right now is about to die. It's probably just a couple years potentially from death because it was competing against the Deseret News, which is the Mormon church-backed, state newspaper. And at some point, they both had to enter into a joint operating agreement where they shared, distributors, they shared advertising, they shared subscription resources. But the Deseret News really controls that centralized source. And so the Salt Lake Tribune has become poorer and poorer and dying while the Deseret News is propped up by the Mormon Church. And what we're seeing is that the Salt Lake Tribune is about to die. And we've seen its ability to really scrutinize the dealings of the Mormon Church seemingly become weaker and weaker over time. And it's really distressing because if you're in Utah and you know about a cover-up or a bishop abuse scandal and you go to the Salt Lake Tribune, they're going to just ignore you. And you don't know why, but you have to ask, how can they fight the Mormon Church when the Mormon Church controls its destiny? And when an active believing member of the Mormon Church owns the Salt Lake Tribune, by the way. I forgot to mention that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is totally akin to within the world of Scientology. They have Freedom Magazine I mentioned earlier, and this news expose publication they put out, and that's their effort, their small time effort at putting some journalism out there, some effort to have some objective validity. Valid, publication that people will read and listen to, but it's so biased. It's so obviously biased. They're so bad at it, that they just can't be taken seriously. And but the Mormons have had many, many, many more years, decades to gain credibility that Scientology hasn't had. That's really the only difference.
Yeah.
Okay,
so where do you want to go next in the modernizing of the Scientology movement?
Yes. Okay. So getting back to our timeline. Yeah. So the tax exemption was pinnacle moment, right? And in fact, every time David Miscavige has a rough time of it, they haul out the videos of that IRS victory and do showings of it to remind everybody, hey, David Miscavige, he's the man, It's almost, we laugh at it. It's pretty hilarious. So, okay, so after that, after Miscavige basically has solid dictatorial control of Scientology and everybody is completely okay with that as a state of affairs.
Right? Because it's too exhausting to fight it.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's nobody who can challenge him at this point. He is the man.
Yeah.
And this is when, this is not when physical abuse starts at the upper levels. Miscavige has beat on people at this point, and done some pretty crummy stuff to people. And I will note at this moment, just to kind of put it out there, that he's married to a woman named Shelly Miscavige, and she, back in the early 80s, they got married. She's been his personal assistant this entire time, knows everything about what he's been up to. Her mother, Shelly's mom, her name was Flo Barnett, died under what I would probably have to say, or at least unusually bizarre circumstances, where, and I don't have the full story on this, and maybe someday I'll go do a deep dive and do a video on this, but this did happen. She committed suicide, quote unquote, by shooting herself with a rifle 3 times.
Oh, yeah.
That's always,
for those who don't know what rifles are, you can't do that.
Yeah, a little hard to do that, right? Somehow this got officially ruled a suicide. And like I said, I might be telling tales here, but the death was suspicious. And Shelly's mother had drifted away from the church and had started doing independent Scientology, started doing Scientology outside the church. And this really pissed off Miscavige and obviously Shelly. And I believe the response when she learned that her mother had died was, something along the lines of, good, that bitch deserved it or something. I mean, I might have some factual inaccuracies here, but the death certainly occurred. The suicide is what it was ruled as, and the rifle was definitely involved. And that's just weird to me. But I can't point to that and say absolutely positively Miscavige's fingerprints are all over that. I can't say that at all. So, but it's just very strange, But we do know for a fact that physical abuse had occurred. He started beating up on people, and he certainly was relegating people to disciplinary assignments that were unduly harsh, to say the least. They could send somebody off to a place ironically called Happy Valley, which was a property adjacent to near the church property out there in San Jacinto. And that was where they would do punishments and long, hard physical labor, under a grueling desert sun without water and stuff like that. I mean, he could torture people at his whim, and it wasn't really a thing. Nobody out in the outside world would know anything about it until years later, when some of these people finally escaped and told their stories.
But he's doing this on U.S. property.
Oh yeah, this is all in California.
Yeah, in U.S. territory. Yeah. That's so weird that he could get away with that level of brutality and lawlessness and not be reported and not be punished.
Well, I want to remind everybody here at this point who is thinking that same thing, because you're absolutely right. Your reaction is not misplaced or wrong, but to understand the situation, remember that all these people that he's doing this to and the people who surround him and make up his entire world are Sea Org members. They are people who have signed these billion-year contracts of commitment. These are not people who are in a rational headspace to that degree,
Yeah, and that's where this notion of I don't know any other way to say it, cult mind control comes in.
Right.
And that's where Stephen Hassan's work with the BITE model. You control people's behavior enough, you control the information that they receive, you're able to control their thoughts, and then you manipulate them with emotions, which is both elation and positive emotions, but also fear and negative emotions. You can get them into a mindset to where they're capable of all sorts of stuff.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
When I was a Sea Org member, I met David Miscavige 3 times, or was interacted with him three or 4 times over the course of the years that I was in. And I didn't recognize the feelings inside me that were coming up when I was around him. Until I got out of Scientology, I didn't recognize that as terror and fear. I called it awe and respect.
Right.
But he was the only person I ever felt those things around. I was terrified of that man, right? Because I knew the power that he wielded. And it was absolute. In Scientology, it's absolute power. He can do anything, and people will get away with that. People he had empowered that were acting, on his authority, beat me up. I got assaulted by a woman who was sent down on one of those missions in the 90s under his orders, and she learned to do that from him. Apparently, is what we all learned. What you learn after the fact. When you're thinking, these guys are great. They can do no wrong. Physical abuse is wrong. Therefore, they couldn't possibly do that or order that. And, but then you find out, no, that was the order of the day up there. Miscavige was just physically abusive to all kinds of people.
Right.
So you get somebody in these headspaces and you control all the information, like you mentioned, and you control the environment. And you're literally the guy who's controlling how much they're eating a day, how much sleep they're getting. When you have that level of control over somebody, abuse is just a matter of time.
Also, and we'll talk about this, the Sea Org, but if people grow up in the church, they have no assets other than whatever the church has allowed them to have. And their livelihood, their jobs, they all are tied to the church. It's a little bit like Scientology. And I don't know if Scientologists are discouraged from pursuing kind of university and graduate level degrees, but I imagine that these Sea Org people, they're church broke, as we call it in Mormonism, where if you fall out of Mormonism, and I think this is probably extra pronounced in the FLDS church, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with these people that grow up, homeschooled in these polygamous compounds. What's your life outside of your religious tradition? You've got no context, no family, no community, and your resume is a bunch of weird religious cult stuff.
Exactly. For Sea Org members, all of the above.
Okay.
For public Scientologists, you have a more normal life.
But certainly for his leadership, for his thugs, if you can call them that, they're going to largely be drawn from the Sea Org. Am I right or not?
Oh, all of them are. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, for sure. David Miscavige's whole world is Sea Org.
Yeah.
He interacts with, he goes to events and he interacts with big donors. He takes, they do photo ops, stuff like that. They give him big trophies. So he interacts with public Scientologists at that level. But other than that, he's not involved in the day-to-day life of Scientologists at that level. But with Sea Org, absolutely, he's the dictator.
Got it. Okay.
And Scientologists generally are discouraged, by the way, from college and all that. Hubbard was kind of down on college. He thought it was all a big waste of time because, of course, he flunked out of it. And he was not a big proponent of higher education. And we used that when we were trying to get people to come join the Sea Org or become Scientologists. If somebody said, yeah, well, I'm going to college, I'm going to do this and that, we'd always poo-poo that. Always, routinely. That's a waste of your time. You should come do this. So we had no idea that higher education was necessary or important in any way.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So what else do we need to know about Miscavige's sort of reign to bring us to modern Scientology? So then we can hear
let's
your
just
story.
cover a couple important moments in time, and I think this will kind of do it for this. 1995. Okay, so just a couple of years after the IRS victory, things are going great, guns, everybody's just peachy keen, happy. And then a woman named Lisa McPherson dies. And she dies in Scientology custody, in fact, Sea Org custody, at the Flag land base in Clearwater, Florida. The Flag base, that whole place is called Flag. And she was a public Scientologist who was, or parishioner, I guess you could say. She came out of Texas, I think, and she had traveled to Clearwater. She was going up the bridge. She had some ups and downs and some rocky starts. She worked for a Scientologist-owned company in Clearwater, and she attested to, she did a bunch of auditing. And she got to the state where they said that she was clear, which is a mid-level, achievement that you want to get to in Scientology in order to be able to move on to those OT levels. Miscavige had personally, because he was at Flag at the time, doing inspections and whipping them into shape and doing all kinds of stuff. He was trying to get Flag into this like $1 million a week operation. He wanted them routinely making at least $1 million every week off of all the services and books and everything that they were selling. So he was hanging around there, and he'd been there for for a while. And he decided to make it his business to delve into people's files who were getting auditing. When you get auditing in Scientology, they write everything down and they put it in folders, and they got your name on the top of it. And it's you end up stacking up many, many, many folders worth of counseling notes when you're going and getting your auditing. I've got, over 50 folders with my, with all the writing of all the notes of all my sessions. So you can open these things up and look at them and see what's going on with the person and what they're saying and what's programmed for them to do next. And Miscavige got involved in that. And he personally looked at her folder and said, she's clear. You guys are stopping her from going clear. Give it to her and have her move on. And the funny thing is Miscavige isn't even trained to make that statement. He's not trained enough in Dianetics and Scientology to actually be able to make that adjudication. But who's going to question him? Exactly nobody. That's who. So she gets told she's clear. Everything's great. Everybody's happy. And I think it was a matter of days later that she has a psychotic break in the streets of Clearwater, where she is somehow involved in an auto accident or some kind of a road incident happens. And the paramedics come out, and she is standing out there in the road without any clothes on. She's taken her clothes off, and she's kind of off talking crazy stuff. And they go, okay, lady, come with us. And they take her down to the hospital. And then a bunch of Scientologists show up. They find out she's there, and Scientologists show up, and they gather her up, and they have her. They've got documents, I think, that she's already signed saying that they are her caretakers, or they can at least get her out of psychiatric evaluation. She does not consent to a psychiatric evaluation. This is all part of the contracts you sign to get auditing in Scientology in the first place, at least at this time. So they had this ability to get her out of the hospital and into their care, and they took her back to the Clearwater building, there in the Scientology building, and they started taking care of her, and they put her on what was called baby watch. And this was part of an action in Scientology called the introspection rundown, which was something, a series of actions Hubbard developed in the early 1970s that he claimed would cure psychosis. And he literally made those claims. He said, psychotic breaks, I figured it all out. I know exactly where it comes from. And here's how you deal with people who have had a psychotic episode. And you lock them up, and you put them in a room. You don't talk to them. You don't say anything to them. You let them chill out. You feed them, and you let them calm down, and you send them notes and this kind of thing. And they started this procedure with her, but she was lost. I mean, she was not totally there. She was not eating. She wasn't sleeping well. She was having a truly psychotic episode. And this is way beyond the pay grade of Scientologists to deal with. They don't have a clue what they're doing when it comes to truly treating mental illness. And it
oftentimes requires heavy psychotropic meds and
exactly, which Scientologists are deaf on. They think that all of that stuff is wholly evil. Literally, they believe. I can't stress enough. I can't really get this across to people well enough with these words, but Scientologists they truly believe that psychiatry has existed for longer than this planet's been around. Mm-hmm. And they think that psychiatrists are trying to destroy civilization as we know it.
Right.
Like that is literally where their heads are at. It's bad.
Yeah.
So they're not about to let anybody get anywhere near a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And they think they know best. And they have these writings from Hubbard that say, if somebody has a psychotic break, this is what you do. So they proceed to do those things. And it's not working. This lady is lost it. And she ends up getting into this incredibly, horribly malnourished state where she's degenerating right before their eyes. They're keeping logs of this. They're trying to make this, go. But this is all happening on church property. Again, I'm skimming over a lot of stuff. There's a lot more details to all this. But the bottom line is she gets to a point where they realize she's about to die. They stick her in a car. They drive her off to, they go past the closest hospital to the Clearwater base because there's no Scientologists at this hospital. They take her to this other one, and she's pronounced dead on arrival. She died. And she died under the care of Scientologists, under Sea Org members. And this was absolutely, absolutely negligent homicide, right? There's no question about it. The coroner report lists her death as either mysterious or unknown or potentially, potential wrongdoing. The coroner couldn't make the call by herself that this was actually a homicide. They started a police investigation, of course, starts, and the church goes absolutely bonkers, shredding documents, shredding evidence. Marty Rathbun, who was a former Scientologist Sea Org member, second under David Miscavige. He was sort of, if you remember Pulp Fiction, Wolfman, the guy Harvey Keitel plays who comes in and cleans up the messes.
Yeah.
That's the role Marty Rathbun played for a lot of David Miscavige's messes. And this was probably the biggest one. And he comes in there and they shred a bunch of the logs and documents and incriminating stuff. And they have to protect, the first priority, of course, is protect David Miscavige. And the second priority is protect the church. And this whole fiasco goes on for about a year of investigations and back and forth. The Clearwater police, I'm not going to comment on their investigation of this issue, but I will say that the Clearwater police are pretty bought off by Scientology. And as a general situation, that has been a problem for a long time. So, and there's various ways they do it. I'm not saying they have to hand them envelopes of money under the table. There are ways of handing police officers money on top of the table that is perfectly legal, that gets them into a biased, prejudiced frame of mind towards the group that's paying them money. And that is how Scientology operates. They don't have to break the law. They can do it within the confines of the law.
And this is the area where it always gets complicated because on the one hand, who can deny that money and power and influence can go as far as to influence the workings of a police force? Like, of course, we have a long history in the United States of corruption at times at all levels of all types of organizations. On the other hand, as I've been exploring a totally different but related subject in Mormonism that we referenced last time, which was this satanic ritual abuse stuff, when people start hating an organization and trying to do what I call criminology, which is to figure out the inner workings of a secret organization. It's not what I call criminology. It's what I understand is known to be this sort of trying to figure out what secret organizations do. It becomes very easy to have all these conspiracy theories rise up where everybody's bought off and everybody's corrupt. And sometimes it's hard to know what's real. Is that true?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely, that is true.
And it's easy for someone who hates Scientology to see the corruption everywhere when in some cases there may be more to the picture. They just don't have all the evidence.
Well, exactly. And I'm death on conspiracy theory. I really hate that stuff. So
hey, you almost swore.
Really hard
you almost swore on Mormon Stories podcast.
So I'm kind of death on that stuff.
That's okay. That's okay. You're allowed to swear if you need to.
Okay, good. Well, most of it's bullshit, right? a lot of global, and I try to differentiate between, conspiracy theory and global conspiracy theory. And I'm not going to get into a big segue on this, but I'm just going to say, when you talk about the Illuminati, you're talking about global conspiracies. When you talk about the Tuskegee experiments, or you talk about Operation Paperclip, or you talk about these kind of things, that really happened. We have the documentation. We know what went down. So I'm not talking about those things. I'm not denying that those things happen. But if you're going to start talking about 12 men running the world through media conglomerates, and they pull the strings of power, and they're the ones who determine what's on the headline of the New York Times every day, I'm going to start questioning the validity of your thinking, because that's just too crazy. So I differentiate those things, and sometimes people who are sloppy, conspiracy type thinkers don't see me differentiating those two things. So I want to make that clear right away. With the police department of Clearwater, what I'm talking about, and this is the same thing with the LAPD, you can hire off-duty police officers, and you can pay them however much you want to for them to do guard duty for your events. I can't think of a better way to open the door to corrupting a police officer than paying them money for their off-duty time to act as a police officer. They come in uniform, they come in their motorcycles, they act in an official capacity, even though they're off-duty.
Right. So police officers are allowed to get side gigs. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
And if Scientology is hiring a bunch of them as security guards, then they've got a side gig that's bringing in important income to their family. And of course, that has the potential of influencing how they would treat Scientology.
Right away. Right. There's no way it doesn't bias any human being. There's just no way. Once you start paying somebody money, they are forced to think better of you.
Yeah, and it's not even like overt corruption. It's just this quote. No. It's this quote, "It's impossible to get a man to see a point of view when his livelihood depends on not seeing it." It's more just like, that's a case I'm not going to take because it doesn't look legitimate, when really it's not always overt corruption. It's just confirmation bias. It's like, oh, those guys are my friends. They wouldn't do that, right?
Exactly. That's how subtle it can be.
Yeah.
It's perfectly legal. Yeah. There's nothing illegal about doing that. And yet, how could it not have a corrupting influence on the people involved?
Right. Yeah.
Right. And how could the church possibly be doing that for any other reason than to corrupt those cops? Because they could hire their own private security anytime they wanted. But they hire the cops. Why? Right?
Yeah.
Plus the front group programs they do, they come around with the Way to Happiness and the anti-drug stuff, and the cops eat that shit up. And they don't look any farther into it than the surface level. They go, well, this looks good, it sounds good, so these people must be good. And it's just a wrong calculation on their part. So it's not a matter of having a bunch of evil, malicious cops who are, twirling their mustaches while they, look the other way. It doesn't have to be that heavy-handed at all in order for it to be corruption. And that's how Scientology operates. They do things that you just wouldn't, think moral people would do, but they do them,